All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another lecture for web and mobile systems. In the last class, we had basically covered some more HTML elements and tags, essentially with respect to how we can develop HTML tables. Okay, so HTML tables was one of the topics that we had covered. We had also covered about how to incorporate different multimedia, along with embedding multimedia from other websites onto our own websites in the form of the iframe HTML tag, right? And these were the main two topics that we covered and within HTML tables. And then we also had HTML form environment, which essentially is used when you are trying to have your users of your website interact with your website and get some data from them, and then send that data either back to a server if your front end is connected to it, or basically do some local processing on the client side itself and then give some results back, right? So HTML form in itself doesn't have any capabilities to interact with the client. It's basically a wrapper around all the input that the client may be able to provide you. So in order to get those inputs, the main HTML element that we use is the self-closing tag that is known as input. And the input has an attribute called type, okay? And within this type, we have many different types of input. So the basic one, the default one, is a text input. So it will create a field where the user can enter some text. Then you have some specific variations of the text input. So for example, if you are going to provide, or if the user is going to provide password, then instead of simply having that input field as text, you would consider, or you will specify that to be a password. Similarly, you can have email, and then you can have something for date. You can have something for both date and time. Okay, you can have a file upload. You can have an image upload. So all of these different options are available when you're trying to specify the input type, right? In addition to that, the last one, which is kind of, again, important with respect to just the form element, is an input type that is known as submit. So that is going to create a submit input button kind of rendering that will be essentially used in order to submit the data that is encapsulated by the, or enclosed by the form element, right? And the way that is done, as we saw when we were trying to implement this, right, is that the form element has two very important attributes, right? And the first one is basically the action attribute, and the second one is the method attribute. So anytime a request is made from the front end side to the back end, right, it is typically in the form of a REST API call, right? If you choose to design it as a RESTful web service, then there are, as we discussed last time, 4 different types of major RESTful API calls that the front end can make, right? And these is basically expressed in the form of an acronym that is known as CRUD, or CRUD, which refers to creating an entry, reading an entry from the server, updating an entry, telling the server to update an existing entry, and then deleting an existing entry, right? So there is a REST API call corresponding to each one of these 4 different type of unique operations that can be carried out against the server, right? And the request sent from the front end side. So that is what the method attribute essentially expresses, is that what type of request the front end is making to the back end, right? So if you have a post request, then essentially what the front end is telling the server, that a data creation entry is requested by the client. So whatever information will be provided here, it needs to be kind of either put into a specific structure that corresponds to the model of the database that you're using in the backend, on the backend side, and then a new entry needs to be created on the database, right? So that is one of the ways which, or this is the purpose of the method attribute, right? So if you just say get, then essentially what the server understands when it receives that request is that the client, using all the information that has been provided within the form element, is requesting to read some data from the server, and the server will appropriately respond back based on the client's request, right? So now that's the method, right? That gives an indication to the server what is being requested. But the question is, how does the front end know where to submit all of this data or all of this information that has been gathered from the client, right? So that requires the front end to know where the server is running and what is the specific server resource that will be responsible for dealing with the data that will be provided within this form element, right? So that URL for the server's endpoint, which is responsible for processing this particular form's data, is essentially specified in the action attribute, right? So that is the purpose of the action attribute itself. All right. So after that, you can do all of the different elements that we talked about. There is also an element that is specifically called button. But right now, we won't be using the button element as such because the button needs some sort of what we call in technical terms an event listener, right? So what this means is an event is classified as any kind of action or interaction that the user will perform against your UI. So this could be, let's say, for example, a left mouse click, okay? It could be in the form of a keyboard entry, right? So if a user types something and some of the letters in the text field, then that is also known as an event, right? So these are some of the different events that can be associated either with the input types or with the button itself. So generally for buttons, you have click-based input types. You don't necessarily have mouse-based unless you put some kind of like a keyboard stroke as an event on the button itself, right? So to do this event listener, we essentially need to know how to write, JavaScript, so we can actually perform these event listener options. There is an alternative to using JavaScript when it comes to capturing events. So, for example, there is this attribute, HTML attribute called onClick. Okay, so in onClick, you can specify, just as you have been specifying type text, type password. So you can specify after a button element that onClick, and then you can perform some sort of script-based action, right? But as far as just HTML, JavaScript is concerned, we discussed this part like at the beginning, that at this point, HTML should only be responsible for structuring, and it is desirable to separate styling, that is a part of presentation, and dynamicness or interactivity, right, which is the part of a responsibility of JavaScript, away from HTML, right? We don't want to embed the features that is not meant for HTML, right? So even though this is a good to know fact that if you're ever in a situation that you have to write a quick script, but that does not require you to generate an entire JavaScript file, there is an attribute that can enable scripting, okay, inline. So this is known as inline scripting because this is happening with the HTML element itself. And that can help you execute some basic level of interactions or event listeners on the web page, right? But we won't be doing this for HTML. Unfortunately, you will realize later on, if you be mindful of this information, this discussion that we're having, that when we go to React, then the way we will revisit this HTML form again, right? Because React does it a little bit differently, and using that we have to understand a concept of state management, right? But when we go to React, we will see that what we have learned in JavaScript on how to essentially add event listener to your UI or your front end will change again. And we won't be using what we have learned. We will be using something a little bit more simplistic, and you will understand the reason behind it, right? So at this point of time, our website generally looks like this. So we can clean this up a little bit, okay, and make it into a proper form. So let's just do that real quick. But before we proceed, let's talk about what I want to do today. So today we will be wrapping up HTML. Okay, so wrapping HTML. So this will result in a quiz on your Moodle. Okay, that will be like the short quiz as we discussed, just no more than 15 minutes it will take for you. And it will also result in, at the end of this week, your first homework or take home exam, whatever you want to call it, for specifically relating to HTML. That will be given 7 days time to finish. Although this will take 15 minutes, right? I will still give you a deadline of 7 days in order for you to be able to finish that, or just to have a reference deadline, just to make sure that you try it out. Okay. In addition to that, I will also talk a little bit about the conceptual basics of cascading style sheets. Okay, version 3. So mostly about the concepts, set up the scenario, talk about some of the basic things that you need to know if you're attempting this for the first time. And then we will talk about some more detailed features and properties of styling rules and how we can apply that to our current project that we are working on, and essentially make this look a little bit more presentable, reasonably presentable, and accessible. Okay. So yes, so once you do start the quiz, you will only have 15 minutes to finish it. So this quiz will be uploaded on Moodle itself. It will be a bunch of MCQ with single option right or multiple option right, true false statements, fill in the blanks, and those kind of questions. There will be no more than 5 questions in total. Okay, and the total points for the quiz is basically 10 points. All right. If there is any questions, okay. All right. So this is essentially what we will be looking at for CSS3 is basically we will talk about its syntax. And at the beginning, whenever you start CSS, there is this concept of box models. So just as we started HTML, if you all remember, we talked about the document object model and how it is used as a blueprint or as a sketch to design your website first, right? And then transform that particular design into code. So for CSS also, we have a conceptual layout based schematic that helps us understand how we need to apply positioning for each and every element on our page, right? So this will be box models. And then we will look at some of the basic properties that is available there. And in the next class, we will apply those properties and see how we can transform the page that we got, right? So again, just to quickly start, what I wanted to do is just probably like pretty up this page a little bit more in terms of structure, because right now it is in like a demo phase. So it's really not conveying structure as much as I would like it to. So this is more of a revision. So just if you have not worked again, so work with me. So what we can do here is basically put like we only had an H1 tag, right? So if we want to maintain hierarchy, and here we can say, please fill out the form below with the required information. And then we can say, and I will get back to something like this. All right. So we can do this. And then let's put a paragraph tag here and what we want to do. Otherwise, alternatively, you can directly email me. Okay. So now what I want to do is essentially, I want to create a hyperreference to my email itself. Right. So for now, till the hyperreferences that we had created was for our pages here, right? So all of the different pages that we had, which was basically a local directory. You also know that if you want to do an absolute hyperreference link, then you will have to do it as HTTPS and then whatever the site's name is, right? So essentially what you want to do right now is to create a hyperreference link for the email, right? And there is a little bit of interesting quirky feature that is out there that HTML provides you when it comes to email in particular, right? So the first thing is, of course, if you want to put any kind of hyperreferences, you will have to enclose the text that you're trying to, link up with a hyperreference inside a anchor tag, right? So that is something that you have to remember if you are not still familiar with it, is that anytime you want to give a hyperreference link, you give an anchor tag. Now you can see here in the Emmet abbreviations suggestions, you can leave the hyperreference link blank. That will ask you to fill it out by yourself, whatever the href is. You can provide a link, which is basically a website link. You can provide a telephone number, okay, or you can provide a mail, right? So the beauty of this is when you hit on the mail, you will see that the beginning of the hyperreference is not something that is similar to a traditional hyperreference link that we gave in the menu bar or the nav bar, right? Or it is not similar to HTTPS. It starts with mail to, right? So here I can say mail to and then MICKMOUSE at OU.edu, something like this, right? And then here you can just say email, and then this we will keep as mail. So another thing to revise while we are looking at this is to remember the fact that there are two types of tags, right? So you have to remember that there is for HTML tags, some are known as block tags. And then there is another category that is known as inline tags. You need to always kind of, as if you're learning this for the first time, keep reminding yourself that what are the features of a block tag? What are some of the well-known examples of a block tag that we use more frequently, time to time in HTML, and what are inline tags? The reason why we go back there is because I'm writing this in a paragraph, right? So you need to know that paragraph is a block tag, so that means it's going to put a new line before and after this particular HTML element. However, anchor tags, is that inline or is that block tag? Because depending on what it is, it will either put a new line right after this content or it will not, right? So that is the reason why you need to learn or remind yourself about the differences between block and inline tag instruction. And of course, in CSS, you can change all of this. You can override the default behavior. But here you can see what we end up having. Okay, and that answers your question as well, that this is basically a inline tag, the anchor tag. Is now if you click on this link, right, this will open your emailing messenger of your computer, and it will take you directly to the email page, right? So if the client has set something like that up, and if the client prefers to send you an email instead of using your phone, then that is an option that you can provide, right? But basically, the same can be done with telephone links and stuff like that, as long as you have the custom support enabled as an extension for VS Studio Code, right, or Visual Studio Code. Okay, but what you have to remember is simply if you can write mail to, then that allows you to enter an email ID with a better hyperreference, right? So now let's just pretty up this situation here. So we had 2 breaks. We can remove the breaks later on. And we had a radio button, which is asking us about the programming language. Okay. Here, the thing about, and when you're working with input, just to revise a little bit, okay, if you keep the name same for all of the different options for radio button, that basically implements the fact that the user can only select one radio button at any given time, because this is one group, right? But when the value is selected, how does it send the appropriate choice back to the server or wherever it is that you're trying to send, is based on this value. So essentially, if you do not have a value attribute for radio buttons and checklists and stuff like that, then the server will not be able to know what value was selected by the user. Okay, an ID is something that is used for this labeling. Okay, so the label basically identifies what this label is for, with which HTML element it's need to be grouped or basically linked together. Okay, so that is something that you need to remember. If you change the name for all of these 3 options, even as a radio button, then users will be able to select multiple radio buttons. But the purpose of radio button is not to have users select multiple options, but to select just a single option. All right. So here, what we can do is just like we had a paragraph tag here, we can put a paragraph tag here, and then say, what is your preferred language for web development, something like this. And after here, what you can write, you put 2 breaks. So all I'm doing right now is just making this a little bit more structured, right? So it doesn't seem like a demo as such. So here, what I can do is I can copy this and then I can paste this here. So this one is going to be my email. Okay, that's not the best way to write it, but I don't want to write it this way either. So I'll just say email ID. Okay, and I will copy this, paste it here, and paste it here, and then say enter your email ID. And here in the text, we will essentially use email, okay, because an email is being given. And then we will put these break statements just for now, because once we go to CSS, we won't have to worry about it here, right? So let's take a check here. Okay, enter your email ID. So if I submit something like JHKL and try to submit it, so this is going to cause an error, right? And the reason why is because this has some sort of verification that is going on, that if an email ID is expected, then it has to be in the email format. And that is the reason why you don't want to use text all the time. You want to use the specific input field if it matches the purpose by using this, the appropriate type. So it provides you some basic level of input sanitization, right? So what that means is like, we verify if the user has provided the input that it has, it is supposed to, they are supposed to provide. So that is something that you can keep in mind, right? So that is the reason why you want to do the proper text. So if I do gmail.com after this, and I can move away from it, and then, this is not showing me the prompt anymore, right? But if you remove all of this information, and if you try to kind of hit the submit button, then it will tell you that, this is not working, right? You have not given the correct input. So something to keep in mind, okay? So again, you have a lot of other attributes. So I'm not putting everything. One of the attributes that I do want to put is basically area where the user can enter their message, right? So here, let me finish this checkbox area first and give it some label, okay? So we want the label to come right after the checkbox or the input box, okay, input checkbox. So we will say here label, okay, and the label is going to be for Python checkbox. So give it an ID, and then it will say Python and then dash Django, something like this. And let's check. Let's put a break statement right after this, all right, and see what we are looking at. Okay, Python dash Django, and then after this, we will give another label here. All right, and this label is something that we want to do. So label for, and then this label is going to be for Java checkbox. Okay, and then we want to say here, let's say express JS. Okay, and then let's put here JavaScript. Okay, and then we can put maybe like another break statement here just to make it look a little bit more understandable, and one more break statement just to create separations, and then the submit button is here. Okay, so the last thing that I want to put on this page is basically after this, I want to put like a area where the user can, let's say, write a review or some sort of feedback and things like that, right? So that is not essentially done using a text box when you're writing a much bigger, what do you call, message. Okay, so you want to use some sort of element that is known as text area itself, right? So if you want to do that, let's try to do it right after where we have requested the user for their email ID. So here, what we would want to say is we want to use the text area attribute. All right. So again, the text area requires a name. All right. So the name will essentially allow us to create the grouping. So here we can say user dash feedback. Okay. We need to give it an ID. So I will use the same name as the ID. And the columns and the rows that is specified by default as the values 30 and 10 determines the size of the text area that will be rendered on the browser, right? So the only thing that remains at this point of time is essentially how we can label this. So if I render this out right now here, so please delete this message, delete this text and type in and provide your feedback. Okay. So let's say if we do this and we go here, you see, you got the text area ready. So if you want to make it a little bit more wider, right? So you can add more columns to it. So here you can see the columns is basically just 30, but if you increase that to 50 or something, then you will have a little bit more wider text area. So you can control from HTML how you want this to be rendered out, or you can control it from a CSS as well by wrapping this around a division tag and then specifying the width and the height of the element, and then make it go 100%. But what is essentially missing here is just similar to these other text fields, right? We do not have any kind of identification on this interface as to what this is, right? So just as we did for the other stuffs, we need to essentially do a labeling for our text area as well. So here, this is the ID that we created. So we will put the ID here. And then here we can simply just say, please provide your feedback and I will get back to you. So now if we do this, this kind of looks a little bit weird. And the reason why it does is, let's put it like this. Okay. So this is the all in all thing, because remember, both label and text area were basically inline in nature. So if we did not force a new line in between them, the browser by default renders this text area right after this text. So that is why things were looking a little bit, off-putting when you saw that, right? But this is what you can do. And now, if you want to do, let's say, a self exercise here, I can give you one, is you can try to create a login / sign up page using the knowledge of HTML forms and its elements. Right? So all of this that we discussed here, try to create another page by yourself to this structure here, this directory structure that is specifically for what do you call it? For the implementation of a sign-up page. And I will give you some interesting ways to do it. Is what you can do is you can try to, on the page, let's say on your index page, what you can try to do is create an HTML button. Okay. You don't need to add any scripts to it, but what you can do, or maybe like a button or a text area. And then what you can do is wrap that in an anchor tag and give the hyperreference to the sign up page or login page, whatever you want to call it. And then in the login page, so you will create login.html. Use whatever we have discussed here at your and what you have at your disposal, right? And then try to create a basic structure of a login page. So where you will have a simple username, okay, you will have, let's say, a password, and then you will have the first name, last name, address, birth date, right? Date of birth. So you can incorporate all of these things. So if you just try that exercise, it will probably take about 30 to 45 minutes, right? Then you will basically revise everything there is to understanding what are the components, various components of an HTML form. And this is pretty important because some categories of websites that you will create that has interactivity will require you to get input from the user as well, right? So if you think of e-commerce websites, if you think of blog sites that allows you to enter comments and stuff like that, if you think of any kind of government-based websites, right? Or if you think of even news websites where you can sign up for the newsletter and stuff like that, they all use this fundamental structure, right, of HTML forms. And within that, the different form elements, right? So if you practice one by yourself, if you're new to this, right, it will give you that confidence to build that confidence, is that when we move forward towards JavaScript and we implement the event listeners and how actually the interactions can be captured and retrieved by the front end and then eventually sent to the back end, that will become easier. That process will become easier, right? So please do try this out by yourself, all right? So once this is done, so this is essentially the end of the main things of HTML that you need to know in order to get something up and running. So just to revise real quick, we looked at how we can create HTML lists, all right? We looked at how we can create HTML tables. We looked at how HTML forms operate and what are the different form elements that allows you to take input from the user, all right? We talked about how to embed images, all right? Then we discussed about how we can embed other multimedia files like audio files, video files, or embedding video or media files from other websites that can be viewed on our platform itself. That is, you don't have to leave and go to the other platform, okay? Thereafter, we also discussed about the two different types of HTML tag categories, which is block and inline. That is something that you have to remember. And the last major thing that is specific to HTML5 itself are the presence of semantic tags. Semantic tags does not render anything differently in contrast to you not using them. But the reason why it is important is because in terms of accessibility, when somebody is using an assistive reading device, then having a tag that is more meaningfully represents the content that it encapsulates is better reflected on you as an HTML developer than you not using it, right? So that is something that you need to keep in mind, all right? And then finally, from a conceptual level, we talked about how each and every web page can be represented as the document object model, which is basically a tree structure to represent the HTML files that you are creating, okay? So any questions overall for anybody who is new to this and may be present in call right now?
No questions.
Okay, thank you. So even if there are, remember, please send me a mail or ask me in the consecutive classes. Essentially, you have to know, and this is for people who are learning this for the first time, okay? There were still some people I remember from the survey who are new to HTML, right? The goal for you is to practice. So do the self-exercises that I talked about, try to add some more features to this website, make it your own. That is what I would tell you, okay? And that's how you're going to learn faster and learn better as well, okay? There is no substitute to practice when it comes to programming. All right, so what we want to do after this is essentially start talking about presentation, okay? So before we head into presentation, when you think of CSS, right, the syntax for CSS is pretty simple, okay? So the syntax, what it involves in its most generic form is basically a selector, okay? We will talk about what a selector is, and then an opening and closing curly braces, okay? And then within that, we look into what is known as a styling rule, or better known as a property of CSS, and then separated by a colon, we specify the value of that particular property that we are engaging with, right? Followed by a semicolon, all right? Remember in HTML, if you forgot to, let's say you started an H1 tag, okay, but you forgot to close it. But remember, H1 tag also has a closing tag, right? So the browser will not throw you an error. The browser will not throw you any warning as such either, because it understands what you're trying to do and it will complete it as a result of that, right? But in CSS, the browser isn't that kind, right? So if you make a syntactical mistake in CSS, then if you make a mistake in CSS, then it is just not going to render, right? So if you see something is missing and you think that you have applied some styling, but it's not working, then the first place that you start looking for is to basically check if you have the syntax correct, right? If there is a typo somewhere, if you selected typically the wrong HTML element, so you're looking for a styling to be applied to a particular area on your website, but it's coming somewhere else. So that means you have selected a wrong element or you have misspelled it, so it's not showing up at all. That's the first debugging area that you will look into. Second, after checking the spelling, make sure you have this colon in place, make sure you have this semicolon in place, right? And this opening and closing brackets and stuff like that, right? So that's some of the common areas of debugging. And the last area of debugging, the third area, is whether you have actually, if you are linking your CSS file to your HTML file, you have to make sure whether this linking is actually done proper, right? Whether the HTML file can actually find the CSS file that you're trying to link it with, and then basically load all the different CSS styling that you have specified, right? So one particular, there are many ways in which you can specify the selector. What it does is helps to identify the HTML elements that are to which you're trying to apply this styling, okay? So there is a question here, just hold on. The main and header tags don't do anything on their own. Can you elaborate a little bit more, James? Yes, they're only for header semantic purposes. They don't render anything differently. That is correct. Okay, all right, good. So for example, let's say in this file, okay, where is it? Let's say we have this body tag, right? So everything that is CSS will be applied with whatever is present within the body tag, okay? And this again requires you to go back to what do you call that? The DOM structure of HTML. So if we just put it together, the DOM structure, one real second, right? So you have the document object, right? And then you have the root node of your HTML, which is HTML itself. And each of these HTML, or not each, but this HTML root node has a head tag, which consists of all the metadata information about your website. And then the body tag, which is basically your content. So anything that is CSS related will be applied to this body content, right? Everything will be here, all right? So that means if I go here, let's say, look at my header file, and we want to give a background color of, let's say, gray, something like this, something simple, right? To the header, whatever the header element is, okay? So if you want to do that, and if we assume, well, we don't have to assume, but we know that there is a single header tag in the entire page, right? There is no multiple header tags. That would be weird. So then what we can do, if we follow this same syntax, then the selector, the way you can do it is by using the name of the HTML element itself. So that means I can use the name of the HTML element, which is header. So if you go back and check your syntax, you have the curly braces. So I will give my curly braces here. Okay. And then inside of that, I have to specify the property. Now, the property here that I'm trying to apply is basically background color. Okay, so background dash color. All right. So how do I know this? By working with CSS for a little bit while, right? For some time. So if you are a beginner, you don't have to memorize this, right? You can open a reference sheet for CSS wherever you find on the web, and you can just check it. And the names are, to a certain degree, for some of them, at least the basic ones, self-explanatory. So you have background color. I might be even wrong with the syntax. I don't know if it's BG color or just background color. So somebody can double check me on that and let me know. But let's say if you want to do text color, it just says color, right? And then you specify the color itself, right? If you're trying to do some text alignment, right? You want to bring it to the center. So you will have something like text align, okay? And then you can specify here what is the value, and you can say center or right or left, right? Similarly, if you want to do font size, you want to control the width. So there are many different properties that are available at your disposal that helps you achieve certain aspects, right? So here I can say the background color is gray. So I can either, background color is correct, okay. So I can either say gray, I can spell it out, or when it comes to coloring, there are two different options of how you want to specify your values, okay? We can use what is known as the hex code of the color, right? So hex code typically start with the hashtag, okay? And then it has 6 hexadecimal values. So it could be something along the lines of, so remember, hexadecimal goes from 0 to F. So that means it goes from 0 to 9, and then it has A, B, C, D, E, F. So that total makes it 16, right? So the 10 digits, 0 to 9, and then the 6 letters, the combination of which makes it hexadecimal. So if you don't remember that, you can take a quick crash course on number theory, and you can get it from there. I think discrete math covered it. But you can give some values such as FA for 6 and then BB. I don't know what this color is, but it will be something on the palette, right? You will see some variations of the hex code kind of group these 2 digits at the same time into a single digit. So some of the hex codes you will just see as F, B, C, okay? But this is less frequent and this is more frequent. People have been using this. The alternative option to hex code is to basically specify the RGB value. Remember, like most of the colors are created using these 3 major colors, red, green, and blue, right? Inside RGB, you have 3 different fields of numbers that you can specify. And each of these numbers range from a value of 0 to 255. So here I can write something like 144, 250, and then 200. And this will also result in some sort of coloring, right? So this is just a little bit of information about the values that you can specify for colors. Then there are other kind of categorical labels such as text align, center, and all those things that can be specified. And then the last type of value is basically numerical in nature. Okay, which means that, let's say, if you want to specify the width of your header element, right, separately. So if you say the width, and then you can give a value of, let's say, 50%. So the percentage value is going to be, again, with respect to the website itself, the browser window, right? You have other options such as, you have other units such as rem, em, you have pixels. So you can choose whatever unit works and try to kind of work your way around understanding what the values are. So let's quickly check. Let me check if we can have some kind of reference sheet for you all to kind of work with, right? So if you just go to w3schools.com, right, then essentially you can find in CSS tutorial, basically the list of all the different properties that you have for CSS, the basic one, as well as the tutorial one, okay? But I will find something better than that, and I will provide that to you all in the next class for those who are new to this, right? So they can have something to refer to and identify what they are trying to do, right? So this is how you can apply basically styling to your HTML, right? So this is the syntax part of it. What remains now is to basically apply or link this styling to the HTML file, okay? So when you're trying to link, so the concept that we're trying to discuss here is to link CSS to any HTML file. Okay, so there are three different ways that you can link it, and I will show you all the three ways, and then I will talk to you about the most desirable way or preferred way of doing it. So the first one is known as inline CSS. Okay, so what inline CSS does is that it applies CSS as HTML attribute. So if you read between the lines, this is a no, because essentially you are implementing CSS using HTML. So there is an attribute called the style attribute. Okay, so if we go back here and if we go to our, where is our header? Here, right? So there is this element that is known as style. So essentially, if you put the style, if you notice here, everything that you see in the suggestion on the screen that you're looking at, they are all CSS properties. So you see here, right here, we talked about background color a little bit a while ago, right? So I can give a background color here, and then I can specify what the color is going to be like. So if I say something like red, you can see that the Visual Studio Code is understanding the palette already, and then it is grabbing what is being said. So now if I apply this, and if I go back and check if something happened or not, you can see that, you know, styling has been applied. But this is something that we don't want to do, again, because of the same reason that we don't want to mix HTML with styling or scripting, right? So we don't want to use this right here. So this way is known as inline styling. That's something that you can remember using the style attribute, all right? Now, another way by which you can link up CSS to your HTML file, the second category, is known as internal, right? So the second category is known as internal CSS. So what this does is in the head tag, okay, of your HTML file, that is where you specify your metadata. Inside of this, you use a tag that is called style tag, not style attribute this time, but a tag in itself that is a part of HTML. And then within that style tag, you can essentially, using this syntax that we discussed, you can write all of the different CSS properties that you essentially want to embed in your HTML file, right? So to do that, what you have to do is basically first identify where your head tag is. So this is where you are working with your head, right? And then here you need to do style. Okay, so here you see the style is being specified as a element and not an attribute, as we saw previously in the example of inline CSS, right? So when you do the styling, then you will do something like header, okay, which is directly naming the HTML element itself. And then you specify the color, that background color. So you see the moment I'm within the style element, the suggestion that I'm seeing from Visual Studio Code has become completely CSS based. It is no longer giving me HTML suggestions. So I can do something like this since it is there, okay? So once we do this and we go back, make sure we save it here, then we can see we have again applied some background color to the header element, right? You can, and I can move things around. So here, what I can do is if I want to, let's say for H1, which is my first header, I want to color it to, let's say something like bisque. I don't know what it does, okay? And then I want to do a text align and I want to put it to center, right? Something like this. So now you can see this is a very bad choice of color. As usual, I'm back at it. Let's say if we want to give something a little bit more, I don't know how this will look, but yeah. But now you can see that previously we talked about the fact that, you know, we will use CSS to move this around, center this around for its positioning. And this is how you can do it. But the main key important takeaway for you is not about these properties that we're applying, but how exactly CSS is being embedded onto the HTML file. So here I will just give a comment, keep this part here. So this is internal style of CSS embedding, right? So this is still not, it's okay. It's better than the inline CSS style. It does not mix HTML with presentation, but it is still not, the most preferred way, because you're still mixing up CSS code in an HTML file. So essentially you don't want to see that happen, right? So I would comment this out, and then we will focus on the final way and the most preferred way of embedding CSS code onto your web page is to use the external CSS file. Okay. And to embed an external CSS file onto your HTML code, what you need to do is, again, be inside the head tag. Okay. So within the head tag, there is an element that we have seen before when we were trying to incorporate the favorite icon image. Okay. If you all remember. But here, the relationship of that is going to be a CSS file. Okay. And then we will specify what is the directory of where that CSS file is present in our code, right? So to see that in action, moving on to that, if we take a look at it, so here in our root directory setup, if we minimize all of this different content, we can see here we have a CSS folder, and inside of that we have a file called style.css. So here I want to put the same thing. So I will just write my basic CSS syntax header, and I will say background color, and I will give it this antique white or something like this. I'll just put this here for check, right? And then I will go back to my index page. I will come to the area here, okay? And I will create a comment, and I will say external CSS linking, okay? And what I want to use is basically the link element or the link tag, right? And you see here previously we had used the link to create our favorite icon. And there's also an option for link to create a linkage to a CSS file, right? So here you see the relationship is no longer a favorite icon. The relationship, this is what the rel attribute essentially expresses, is to tell the browser that this is a style sheet, okay? And then we have a hyperreference to style.css, but this is not the correct path. Of course, we all know that, right? Because we have our CSS neatly organized inside a subdirectory. So I will specify inside the root directory, because I am in index.html. So that is the root directory is the root directory. I will go to a CSS file, and then I will put style.css. Okay. And now if I do this and save my HTML code, I should be able to see this structure. So now what we have created is a neat separation between HTML and CSS, right? So you can go back to your styles.css and you can start putting in different stuff like that. So we talked about the header. We wanted to give it a color, and I think we chose brown. Okay, and then we gave it a text alignment, and we called it center. Okay, so if we make changes there, you can see that it keeps on reflecting it, because now you have a good tie-up here. Okay, but we need to do this, unfortunately, again, as we did it for our menu, for all of the different pages that we have in our subfolder, right? So I have to go to my contact me HTML file, and I have to, where is my head? Here, right? So I have to link this, but I have to change the directory now, because we have to move one level up. So this is where the file is. So I have to move one level up. There I will find a folder called CSS. And inside of that, there is a file called style.css. So hopefully this link is correct. If not, we can verify it later on if nothing works. I will go to hobbies page. So hobbies page, I'll do the same thing. Okay, and it will have the same directory because it's in the same subdirectory as well. I will go to the projects page, do the same thing. Is anything left? I think the resume page is left. Okay, and I will do the same. So right now, what I just did is I specified the correct path and linked all of these different HTML pages that we had on our website to this sole CSS file. Okay, so now that we understand the basic syntax of CSS, how to associate CSS with HTML, what are the three ways and what is the preferred way. Let's talk a little bit more about the selector, okay? Because this selector is one of the key important aspects that allows you to apply styling to your HTML pages, right? So we need to understand a little bit more about how or what are the different ways in which you can specify your selector. Okay, so that kind of is something that is important if you're learning this for the first time. Okay, so the first thing that we already saw is you can just name the HTML tag. Okay, but this is only applicable as long as the HTML tag is unique on the HTML page. All right, so that means if you have a single header tag, because otherwise what will happen is if you are not interested in applying the same styling to all of the HTML tags with the same name, then that will create a problem, right? So for example, let's say if we have a situation here that we can use to, understand this better. Do we have multiple paragraphs? So we have one paragraph here. Okay, so let's just do one thing. Let's just say here in paragraph, okay, I just want to give a background color of aquamarine. So this is pretty straightforward to understand per se, is that anywhere you should have a paragraph, right? So here you can see that I had 3 different paragraphs and all of the paragraphs will be applied the same styling, right? If you do not want this to happen, that is, if you want to choose separate styling for even the HTML tags with the same name, then you cannot use this way of specifying the selector, that is by using the HTML tags, right? So that is something that you have to be careful about as to how you want to implement. The other aspect is you can name the CSS selector using the ID of HTML elements or using the class name of HTML elements. All right. When you're specifying a selector with ID, then you will have to use the symbol hashtag, the character hashtag, followed by the ID name that you have given. Okay, whatever the ID value you have given. So for example, if you go back to our index.css page, okay, where is it? So here you can see that I have a division with an ID called app container. So if I want to refer to this particular HTML element, okay, wherever this div ends with the ID and not the name. If it was using the name, I would just set div as the selector, but I want to use the ID. So what I want to do is copy this, of course, so I don't have to write it all over again. And then what I need to do is give a hash character and then specify this. So this is how I can choose using ID of HTML elements. And inside of this, I can again do the same thing for a quick check. Is put this. So now this should show me on my home that everything is the same color. All right. Now, let me pose a question here for you is how does the name cascading style sheet come into the picture? Okay, but before that, let me just finish something before I move on to that, is basically how to do it using the class name, right? So if ID is done using this symbol called hashtag, then class name is essentially specified as a selector using the dot operator. So you give the dot operator and then specify whatever class name you have given, right? So this is for multiple groupings. And let me check. I think we had put a class name somewhere. Does anybody remember where the class name is? Or just check it in your code as well. Have class, no, we don't. Okay, we probably don't, but what I can do here is go to the index, right? Create a class here and say it will be called container class. So when you're trying to select a HTML element in CSS using its class name, then what you need to do is put dot and then the name of the class and then open the curly brackets and then put background color and then this, right? So here is another question that I wanted to pose to you is why CSS is called cascading style sheets, right? So the name is cascading style sheets, right? So there's this keyword called cascading, which means one after the other. Okay. So to understand why CSS is called a cascading style sheet, there is this scenario that we need to understand that here, the way these two styles are written, right? You have the app container, which is basically pointing or selecting this div element and whatever content is inside of it. And then you have another styling rule that is using a different selector name, but is still selecting the same div element, right? And here you can see you have given two colors. It's essentially different from each other. So what do you think will happen when you look at the browser? What the browser is going to do? Any guesses? Which color do you think should be shown on the website? Anyone?
Aquamarine.
Okay. Why?
Because you specified it kind of in the hierarchy there, right? Like I think that's more specific than just the app container color.
Not specific. So what happens is if you apply multiple styling rules to the same element, then the browser is going to select, by default, the browser is going to select the styling rule, which is sees at the very end. Okay, so yes, there is a hierarchy, but essentially what it boils down to is which styling rule is seen by the browser at the very end. Okay, so that means here, if we check this, then we should see aquamarine, but it's not showing it. Did we save everything? Is this the element or no? All right, let's double check this. All right, and by the way, this is how you put comments in CSS, /* */*. All right, let's see what is happening. All right, so there is something wrong that is happening. Okay, this is not the default behavior. All right, let's talk about the hierarchy real quick, and let me do something here and change a little bit and see if the browser is still behaving like this or not. So I don't want all of this. What I want to do is basically take the div element that we have here. Okay, and is there only one div here or there are multiple divs? There's just one div. Okay, let's see what happens. So let's put a different color here. Let's put gray. All right. All right, so it's not behaving the way it should behave. Essentially, it's basically stuck with that particular element.
I think IDs take like precedence.
Reference?
Over, yeah.
Oh boy, that is something that I did not know. All right, so let's put it this way then. If that's how it wants to behave, then let me put div and div. All right. So what is the last color that we did? Aquamarine, right? Yeah, so now it's working. I think you're right. All right. So a good thing to learn here is that if you do the ID, apparently the browser is giving this the highest preference and kind of overriding the default behavior. All right, but however, the normal default behavior that we should be knowing for CSS, which essentially expresses the cascading part of cascading style sheets, is that whichever styling rule, the rule which is seen by the browser last at the very end, that is the rule the browser is going to apply unless you override it. Okay, you can essentially override it by using this syntax, not hashtag, but exclamation important right after the styling rule in order to override it. That's what I knew it. I never knew that you can use just ID to override everything. But one of the ways in which you can override, in addition to the ID, is to basically use the syntax not hash, exclamation important right after your styling rule property and value. Okay, so what this does is that, let's say if you have an external file like we do in this particular scenario. So if you have multiple occurrences of the styling rule on the same element, then the browser is supposed to only select the one that it sees at the very end. So basically, which will be at the very end of this, right? However, if you put something like this, so right after this, if you put something like important, then this is supposed to trump all the other cascading rules, okay? And then only use the one which is specified as important, right? So this is kind of good to know, is the fact that if you have multiple developers working on it. I see. Thank you for that information. So what the information that has been given to us, and thank you very much, Sean, for that, is when you're specifying CSS selectors, okay, the ID way of specifying has a preference over class name, and the class name has a preference over the tag names being div, p, head, h1, and the class name and the ID name was what we did a little bit before, right? And that's why the browser was just choosing the ID. And if I remove the ID, apparently it will just give preference to class names over tag names and stuff like that. Okay, so this is good to know. Just please remember this. Okay, it's a good piece of information. All right, so whatever comes in the external file at the very end. So this is when we are not using ID and class name, if we have everything to be the same, right? So everything is either ID, well, that would be weird, or everything is class name, and then everything is tag name. So one of the categories, right? So then it will follow. The next thing, what takes preference over external file is basically the internal style tag. So what happens is when the page loads, when any page loads, right? All the information in your metadata is basically loaded up, right? And that's when if you're linking, then this link happens. But you see, right after this linking, I have an internal CSS element, okay, which again is applying styling rule to the same element itself, okay? And as a result of that, the browser will drop all of these styling information, okay? As long as it doesn't follow this situation here. And then it will apply the styling rule here. And the one that is, of course, will be in the highest hierarchy is because after the metadata is loaded, that is after the head section is loaded, the body section will be rendered by the browser, which will show all the actual contents to the user, right? So if you use any kind of inline styling, as we discussed here, inline styling, which uses HTML attribute of style, then that will trump the previous two operations. So that means the one that comes at the very end, with the highest preference, is basically the inline CSS. Okay, and to do inline CSS, you essentially are using the style attribute. So this is essentially a part of HTML and not CSS per se. Okay, and this is the style element or style tag, whatever you want to call it. All right. So this is something you have to remember. And again, remember the fact that if you want to trump, okay, override this default hierarchical behavior, then you need to use this syntax exclamation important right after you have specified your styling rule, right? What you have done here. Okay, so that is something that is good to know. So again, to recap this, you can use to specify the selectors, okay, using the tag names for HTML, or using the ID, HTML attributes ID, but with this character hashtag ID, or using the class name by using the dot operator and then the class name. In terms of hierarchy, a good to know thing is that if you specify the CSS styling for a singular element using, let's say, tag name, ID, and class name for the same thing, then there is a hierarchical order that is present here that we learned today, is that ID takes the preference over class name. Okay, and then class name takes the preference over tag names. All right. Another thing to note about selectors is that if you have multiple elements to which you want to apply styling rule, but they are not the same thing, right? So for example, let's say here, if I have a situation, all right, so let's clean up our CSS code a little bit. So we don't need this anymore. All right, and we don't need this style tag anymore. So I will comment all these things out, save it here, save it here. Let's say everything looks good. All right. So let's say we have this division here. So let me just revert it back to my original way of referring to it, so that you have option to see this. Okay. All right. So if you want to apply the same styling to multiple different elements, so let's say you have a header tag here, and then you have a footer tag here, right? And I want to apply, let's say, the same background color to both my header as well as my footer here, so that I can separate them together. So the way I want to do that is basically separate it with a comma and specify the two different elements. So here, what I can say is comma footer, okay, and then change this color a little bit. So we use something else. Let's, okay, I don't know, let's just use this just for the sake. All right, so now we can essentially choose a different color for multiple elements by specifying it as a part of the same selector. Okay, so you can separate different selectors if you are going to apply the same styling to it, separate it using a comma, and then apply all your different stuffs. All right. Okay, so that's mostly about the selectors. There are some advanced selectors as well. We will talk about that a little bit later when we understand the basics. All right. So we looked at the different properties that we had. So some of the basic properties such as background color, color of the text, how to align the text. You can also do some operations with respect to font sizes. So font weight is basically how deep it will look. So if you do the font weight and let's say you put something like 800, all right, so that is going to basically pop up the what do you call the heaviness of the text that is there, right? In addition to that, you also have the option of font size itself. So you can either specify using some of the categorical labels that is present here, or you can specify it using percentage value. So that percentage value is again with respect to the window size. And then some other units are there for you to specify in either inches, millimeter, points, rems, and stuff like that. So you can check those out if you would like to, right? So I can put here basically something like, do I have extra large? No. So let's just say larger. And that actually overrides the default size that H1 tag uses, right? So if I essentially do this, so you can see that the H1 tag in itself has a bigger font size than the font size larger that CSS can provide us, right? So these are some of the options on font sizes. So if you check, you have the font family as well. So that allows you to change your font type, right? So we are familiar with. And the way this works here, you can see here that multiple different font types are separated by comma. That is based on the preference. Okay, so that means the first one will be used by the browser. If the client's browser doesn't have that font type installed in it, then it will go to the next one. So for example, let's say we give this, right? So this is basically saying that this Franklin Gothic medium is the first preference of my font family. If the client's browser doesn't have that, it will switch and try to look for Arial narrow, then Arial, and then finally, if nothing is there, the ever-present sans serif, right? So if you do this, you can see that ever so slightly, the font has changed, right? So we can essentially change this to see if we get some difference in some other font family. Is there a, what do you call it? Like a cursive font family? Okay, so here you can see things are now changing essentially. All right, so you can change the font family there. Generally, you don't prefer cursive. You can just want to choose something that is a little bit more Arial in the sense. So we'll just keep here. Okay. All right, so these are some of the font families and things that we use, but one of the most important key aspects, and we will revisit some of these CSS styling rule one by one when we kind of clean up our web page here that we have developed for ourselves. Right now, it still looks a little bit funky, but we can change all of those things, right? So we will look at it one by one when we go through it. But what is most important here is because when we move forward, there is something with respect to layout that we have to address, right? And especially when we are going to design this nav bar and start learning about flex boxes, right? And how it helps with respect to positioning of different elements on the web page, we need to understand layout, right? But before you even get to layout, you need to understand the box model in CSS, right? That is one of the best ways to start CSS before you are designing your website, right? So what the box model says is that when you visualize every content, every HTML element that will be on the page, then the element would have some content, right? So that content is basically in the form of some kind of text, some kind of image. So this is the actual content, right? And the content in itself has its own width, right? So there is a width of this content as to how much text is present and so on and so forth, okay? But what the box model suggests is around the content, there is actually a border. Okay, so this is known as the border, all right, which basically shows what is the extent of this content. And the gap between the border and the content is basically known as padding. Okay, and then around this entire HTML element that is beyond this border, that is the separation between one HTML element from another HTML element, is expressed using another positioning value or property that is known as margin. Okay, so the margin is basically the separation of one HTML element from another HTML element. Okay, so this essentially captures the positioning of every HTML element in the website or in the web page, right? So that means if you want to evaluate the total width or how much space a particular element will take on a web page in terms of its positioning and layout, then you have to essentially do margins width. So every margin will have a width, right? Then you have to do basically the border. The border will have a width as well. You have to do the padding. And then whatever the size of the content is. So that means when you start applying styling to, let's say, this image here, okay, then this image, the width and the height, as we learned in HTML, was just whatever the content was, right? But when you go into the realm of CSS, right, and you start to figure out that how will you position and lay things down on your web page, then you always have to think first in terms of the CSS box model, which dictates or which states that you have the width and the height of your content, but then you have a border around it, and the separation of the border and the content is basically padding, and then wrapping the entire thing up is a margin which separates it from other HTML elements. So when you're trying to think in terms of how much space an element is going to take, you will have to think in terms of all of these different aspects of the box model to make that final decision. Sometimes you might choose not to give a margin. So that will allow your elements to be kind of spaced a little bit closer to each other. So if you want a space between the margin, if you want space between two HTML elements, then you need to increase the margin essentially, right? So the margin can be specified on top, on left, on right, and on bottom. Okay, so you can have top margin, right margin, bottom margin, and left margin. So these are some of the different subcategorical values of each margin. So similarly, you can have border top, border right, border bottom, border left. Similarly, padding top, right, bottom, left, right? If you specify a single value, then what happens is that CSS basically applies the same value to all four margin types. So sometimes it is tedious to just apply, or write multiple numbers for all of the different four areas if they are same. So if I do something like this, let's say, for example, if I take margin and I don't specify whether this is top, bottom, right, or left, all I do is just write, let's say, 2 pixels. If I do something like this, right, then essentially when it is applied, then the browser understands that since there is a single value, so that means all four sides of the margin will have 2 pixels. Okay. Then there are other shorthand ways of specifying these values for margin, padding, border. Okay, there is nothing for the content. The content is the content itself. So essentially using CSS, you will be working with 3 positioning and layout properties, which is the margin, the padding, and then the border. Okay, so the other shortcuts that you have is basically if you write something like this, right? So if you have 2 and then 3 and then 2. If you do something like this, so then what the browser is going to do is it's going to apply 2 to the top, 3 to the sides, and then 2 to the bottom, which will be kind of funny because it's the same thing. So let's say we make this 4. So if I just write 2 and 3, so it will apply 2 to top and bottom and 3 to right and left. If I write 2, 3, and 4, then it will apply 2 and 4 to the top and bottom, and then it will apply 3 to the sides. Essentially, that's basically 1 value, 2 value, 3 value. And then if you have to write 4 values at that point of time, then it will go in this direction. That is, it will do top, right, bottom, left, and then apply those 4 values. Or if you know that you just want to apply the margin to a specific side only and nothing else, then you can choose these categories. So you can essentially say margin dash top, and then you can say 6 pixel and leave the rest as is. You don't want to apply anything there, right? So that way you can create separation between different HTML elements on the website, okay? And then if you want to create separation of the content from the border of the content, then you essentially work with the padding. Increase the value, the separation increases. Decrease the value or have nothing, then essentially they collapse on top of each other, right? So understanding this basically creates an understanding of how we are going to move these things around here, right? So if you take a quick work through example, let's say I want a little bit more separation of this from whatever this element is, right? Because eventually we will get rid of all these horizontal rules. We don't want that on the web page, right? So if I want to do that, if I want to separate this element, which is an H1 element, with, let's say, this header element. So wherever this horizontal rule stops, or this color that you see, this is essentially the header element, which has the nav element. And within the nav element, you have this listing, right? So if I want to create separation between the header and the H1, okay, we have to find what is this element. So I think the header is outside. Okay, so it's here. So what you can do is you have a few options here. You can either choose the main element, which is basically the neighboring element of header. So right after the header, you have the main. So you can give some margin to the main. That is one option. Or if you give some margin to the H1, then that will create a separation of H1 from main itself, but you will still see a separation of H1 from its previous element, which is the header element. So this is how thinking in terms of the box model will help you kind of identify that how do you need to move things around, right? So for example, here, I can, if I just want a separation between these two, what I can do is margin top and I can give some value, okay? And that is going to create some separation. Similarly, if I want separation below as well, then I will do margin bottom. If I want separation everywhere, then I can do things like that, right? So this is how the box model helps us visualize the layout and positioning of elements on the web page. Okay, it helps us to kind of understand that and then apply that, right? So in the next class, essentially on Tuesday online, I would start to kind of apply all of these styling, okay? And maybe first start working with our navbar, design the navbar a little bit, and then clean up this page, not this one, but all of the different pages that we have, and then make it look more presentable as we go forward, right? So to wrap up the class, remember to revise HTML because we are done with HTML at this point of time. Understanding CSS, the important thing is remember the syntax. This is basically what the syntax looks like. So this is something that you have to get used to, okay? Know the different ways of linking CSS to HTML files, which is you can do it as a HTML attribute, you can do it as an HTML element, or you can, with a preferable way, do it as a separate file that is linked with your HTML file, okay? So that, and the third thing that you should just revise a little bit is what is the CSS box model, okay? So these three are basically some of the important opening topics in CSS, okay? In the next class, we will start doing the proper CSS applications to our portfolio website that we created, starting with the design of navbars, right? So we will look at how we can create a vertical navbar, and then we can look at how we can create a horizontal navbar and look into a little bit about responsive design as well. That is, if you make the window a little bit shorter, how does the navbar behavior kind of changes with that and stuff like that. And we'll clean up the rest of the page, okay? So I will stop the screen share here and the recording, and I will see you all again in the next class.